The Australian economy isn't in a recession, but it sure feels like it. Is there a term for that? Before 2024, there wasn't, but Australians who've had to place back essential items on the shelves during their grocery runs have come up with one. It's called vibecession. In other words, when leading economists are telling you that everything's all right and couldn't be better, but you know that's not true. Take, for example, the fact that one of the biggest issues in Australia right now is unemployment. People are complaining that they cannot find work. Every sector's filled to the brim, and it's hard to find a way to make a living anymore. The numbers, however, don't reflect that. Unemployment has remained fairly low in Australia, at a constant 3.5% for several years. Which brings us to the next question. Are the numbers lying? They're not, but neither are the people who are complaining of a crashing economy. All the while living in an otherwise thriving one. So what's real and what's not? And what's happening to the Australian economy? Let's find out. The median income for a household in Australia between 2000 and 2001 was a little less than $35,000. Today, it's close to $55,000. Based on these numbers alone, you'd think that Australians don't have anything to complain about. They're obviously getting richer every year. However, an interesting phenomenon we need to discuss here is wage push inflation. In other words, when a high wage correlates to a high inflation rate. Firstly, inflation is accumulation of several factors, and it's not as negative as people may think. In some cases, inflation is considered necessary to keep from the real villain, hyperinflation. That's when a country tries to artificially reduce inflation for so long that eventually the economy comes crashing down like a house of cards. In a nutshell, inflation is a tricky and often controversial topic. People don't really like talking about it because they're convinced all of their troubles are because of it. Wait till they hear that inflation goes up every time they get a bonus. In hindsight, it wouldn't just be them. It'd be the whole sector, and then their whole company, a couple of others, and before you know it, most of the country. This is known as wage push inflation or cost push inflation. Basically, when the price of services and goods goes up, the company makes more money and subsequently has enough funds to give people more incremental bonuses. This doesn't mean that they're suddenly rich enough to afford a vacation home now, just that their new salaries reflect the new price of goods. Essentially, they're still living the same lives they were already living. So, even if the median income today is $55,000 compared to $35,000 in the 2000s, it hasn't made much of a difference in people's living standards. But then, why did life seem easier back then than it does now? Again, the numbers reflect facts, and, at least in this case, they haven't been tampered with. So the question becomes, why has there been a dip in the standard of living when it really should have stayed the same? For that, we'd have to talk more about vibecession. If you haven't figured it out already, vibecession is more of a state of mind than an actual projection on a chart. In this case, it's when the vibes are telling you the country's headed toward a recession, or you're already in one, even when that's not really the case. Okay, then what would be a real recession? That's when the GDP goes down over 2 consecutive financial quarters. The numbers from 2023 weren't great by any means, but they didn't reflect a recession at all. In December, the calendar year concluded with a 0.2% rise in the GDP for that month and a 1.5% rise overall. Jim Chalmers told the Australian public that the numbers weren't optimal and that the country would work on raising its GDP in the next fiscal quarter. He didn't use the dreaded R word at any point, and that's because he didn't have to. In fact, projections for 2024 show that the Australian economy is headed toward a 1.8% rise in the GDP at the end of the fiscal year. These numbers might make people who are quite obviously struggling to make do in today's economy feel like they're in a fever dream. The numbers clearly don't reflect how they've had to tighten their budgets and nearly deplete all of their savings. Again, the numbers don't lie, and neither is the average Aussie lying. So, who is? The median income has gone up, but so has inflation, and in turn, whether the average citizen wants to or not, so is spending. It might surprise you to know that all of this, as grim as it may be for the average consumer who's struggling to pay bills right now, is actually boosting the GDP. So their spending, even if they're dipping into their savings, is what's keeping the country from going into a full-blown recession. And instead, you guessed it, a vibecession. Let's run this next bit with an example. Renters are struggling to pay high interest rates because of inflation. Now, interest rates go up whenever inflation does for several reasons. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States, often increase interest rates to combat inflation. By making borrowing more expensive, higher interest rates reduce consumer spending and business investment, which in turn can slow down the economy. They might tighten the money supply to curb inflation, reducing the amount of money available for lending. This scarcity of loanable funds can lead to higher interest rates as borrowers compete for the limited available credit. When inflation is high, lenders demand higher interest rates to compensate for the reduced purchasing power of future interest and principal payments. This is because the money that they're repaid with will have less value in the future if inflation continues at a high rate. Both consumers and businesses often seek to borrow more to purchase goods and services before prices rise further. This increased demand for credit can drive up interest rates as lenders can charge more due to higher demand. The truth is that they want you to spend more money because your spending invariably drives the GDP and keeps the country from going into a recession. The GDP measures the total value of all goods and services produced within a country over a specific period. It includes consumer spending. Now here's the thing. Spending fuels business revenues, encouraging production and potentially leading to job creation and wage increases. On the other hand, when people save more instead of spending, the immediate demand for goods and services decreases. Lower consumer spending means businesses experience reduced sales, potentially leading to lower production, layoffs, and slower economic growth. Consequently, GDP growth slows down or even contracts. While savings can eventually lead to investment, with banks lending saved money to businesses for expansion, this process takes time. The immediate effect of increased saving is reduced consumption, which directly impacts GDP negatively in the short term. Does that mean people should just stop spending money? Economics is a lot trickier than you'd think, and one of the trickiest things would be classifying what is and isn't a recession. The introduction of vibecession makes it more complicated than ever before. However, after learning that it's your spending that drives the GDP and consequently keeps inflation rates high, you'd think that a simple fix would be to just break it down to the bare essentials. That means spending only on things that you need at the moment or finding a way to make do with whatever you have despite the circumstances. The thought process here would be to stop inflation at the consumer level by, essentially, consuming less. However, an idea like this is similar to suggesting that central banks should print more money to make people richer. Remember hyperinflation and how we talked about that being an absolute death sentence for an economy? It had a lot to do with printing more money, at least in Zimbabwe's case it did. There even came a point where their central bank started printing $1 trillion notes. In today's economy, that would be equal to $1. Again, it's a lot trickier than it seems. But let's run with the idea that consumers should start spending less and less to bring down inflation. When people stop spending money, the economy faces significant challenges, as illustrated by Saul Eslake, the former chief economist for ANZ Bank. When spending decreases, businesses see lower revenues, leading to reduced production, layoffs, and a potential rise in unemployment. This cycle of reduced income and spending can create a recessionary environment, negatively affecting economic stability. Eslake explained that during periods of reduced spending, such as the 2008 financial crisis, the economy suffered as businesses failed to sustain operations due to decreased demand. Retailers and service providers are particularly vulnerable, resulting in widespread job losses and financial instability for many households. This would force the government to respond with measures to stimulate spending, such as lowering interest rates and increasing public spending, to revive economic activity and restore confidence, something the frugal movement would have hoped to achieve in the first place. Then again, reduced spending would impact government revenue from taxes, leading to budget deficits and potential cuts in public services. The ripple effects extend to all sectors of the economy, from manufacturing to retail, causing a contraction that can be difficult to reverse without significant policy interventions. While saving money might be the goal for several Australian households, widespread reductions in spending can stall economic growth, highlighting the delicate balance needed between saving and spending to maintain economic health. Australia has gone into an actual recession several times in the past. The latest one was from 1991 to 1992. While inflation did go down as interest rates went up and people couldn't spend the amount of money that was otherwise necessary for them to live, it also caused a significant effect on unemployment. It was up by 10%. While the current landscape, with vibecession and all, might make it seem like unemployment is at an all-time high, 3.5% is nothing compared to the 10% in the 90s. Speaking of which, Australia had to fight long and hard to get down from double digits. But what if the current economic conditions force people into another recession? Would Australia be able to overcome it? Economists have warned Australians that 2024 will be a challenging year for them. This just serves to prove that you should go with your gut feeling. The vibes weren't off for this one, and leading economists in the country fear that a recession might happen, despite the numbers. The after effects of the spike in inflation after COVID-19 are still happening, and economies are struggling to keep up with a major setback. 2024 won't be easy on Australia, especially not considering the numbers from 2023 and how they fell behind projected outcomes for the country. So far, Australia's GDP is increasing, and for a recession to take place, you'd need at least 2 consecutive periods of downturn. Economists are currently playing a balancing act between managing inflation, supporting economic growth, and addressing household and business financial stress, all of which will be crucial in determining the country's economic trajectory over the next year. Suffice it to say, however, that Australia has proved to be quite resilient in testing times. For example, during the global financial crisis, the country avoided a technical recession despite economic stress. Even with COVID-19, there was a brief refractory period, but the Australian economy was able to rebound by easing restrictions and government foresight. Government projections suggest that while economic growth may be below trend, a full-scale recession might be avoided. The Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, forecasts GDP growth of 1.8% for 2024, with inflation easing to around 3.2% by mid-year. We'll have to wait and see what happens, but thanks for watching. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more, and while you're here, check out some of our other videos.